We spent 2 years designing and testing the new Mega Mower X brush cutter. That meant we spent a lot of time going over the fine details to make our brush cutter stand out from the competition. Two of those features that I'd like to show today are the 30-degree mounting plate angle and the shorter overall deck length. Those two features together mean that you have a shorter footprint when coupled to the skid steer loader. This is very important when you're cutting trails in areas with large trees that might be densely populated or with other obstructions. The shorter footprint means that you can turn around in a tighter area, and this can be very handy in those situations. So I want to talk a little bit about the area where we were testing here the last 2 days. This is 65 acres of former forest that has been logged, and it had a lot of oak, ash, and popple trees on it, among others, some birch too. It was pretty much clear cut, and the saplings have now been allowed to grow back, and it was logged maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. So there is a ton of rocks and stumps still left out here, and the best way I can describe it is that it's a minefield. It's a terrible place to mow, but it's an excellent place to test because not only do we have the chance to mow and try to grind some of these stumps up, but we also hit some obstacles accidentally. An example of that is that I've hit no less than 6 rocks while being out here, the largest of which is this one right here. This is a large granite rock that is protruding quite a ways out of the ground, and I hit it really hard. And I wanted to demonstrate that even though we removed large pieces of this rock, the AR400 blades that we have stood up to that test. Now, you're always going to be finding rocks when you're using a brush cutter, and you want to know that your blades are going to stand up to that impact. Yes, the blades are going to sometimes get notches in them or get slight bends in them when they hit something hard like this, but you want to ensure that the blade is tough enough so that it doesn't crack and break off, and that's exactly what the AR400 does in our brush cutter. This is an example of the typical saplings that we're mowing here today. By far the most common is the popple or aspen sapling. Most of them are under 2-inch diameter, so it's really not hard to mow them. The challenge here is that they're so densely populated that you get a large amount of vegetation even though each individual piece is small. So there are times when it's so thick in here that I have to slow down a little bit just to let the mower digest the material. Oftentimes you'll come across logs in the woods that are either too large or too hard to process. Now here today, there's several downed aspen trees that have effectively rotted, and I'm able to process those quite easily. But some of them, like this and some of the oak trees, are just too large and too hard for me to process. I'm just going to push them to the side. This area is being turned into a pasture, so we can collect those trees later and stack them up with a grapple. Now when you come across these downed trees, you'll find that they're generally in 2 orientations. One is longitudinal or in line with your skid steer loader, and the other is lateral or at a perpendicular angle to your skid steer loader. And you can handle these in 2 different ways. The way I like to do it is for the longitudinal, I'll use the front tip of the mower deck and simply push on the end of the log. Then you can control that log and kind of steer it as you push it out of the way. That works really well. And for the lateral positioned logs, I like to use both sides of the deck to push that almost like it becomes like a snow blade where you're just pushing that log straight ahead. Now, if you want to steer this log, you can still turn your skid steer loader, and the serrated edge of those sidebars really enable you to grip the log and control it even if you're just pushing it from one side. That is the key difference in our deck versus the competition. So I want to make one note about the ability to use our brush mower deck as a pusher, and that is that even though it is a huge productivity gain to be able to do that in these situations, you want to use common sense and be careful. The first thing you want to be mindful of is that you have shut the hydraulics off. We don't want the blades turning and hitting the ground when you have that mower in a nose down attitude. Secondly, you want to be mindful about and careful not to hit large rocks or immovable stumps. If you're in that nose down attitude, that has the ability for the blade carrier to contact things that are close or sticking out of the ground. So just use common sense and be careful when you're using this feature. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about using brush cutters as stump grinders. Brush cutters obviously can be used in situations where you want to shorten or remove some stumps. They're very energetic, very powerful tools, and so you can grind stumps, especially smaller, softer stumps. In the area where I'm working here today, there's a lot of larger and harder stumps, and I'm simply avoiding those altogether because it takes either too much time or I think it's going to be too hard on the brush cutter. Anytime you hit harder, larger objects like stumps or large logs that are especially hardwoods, it is hard on everything. You're impacting the whole system, and even though it might not break something today, it may shorten the lifespan over the entire life of the product. So you want to be careful and use that feature in select cases where it really makes sense, where it boosts your productivity. My personal preference when it comes to grinding stumps is to actually use the blades rather than the carbides. I feel that the blades, because they're more energetic, they're moving faster, you can grind stumps faster, and you can also kind of see where you're cutting so you can control the cut easier. The way I like to grind stumps is taking it off in layers. So I'll start at the top and maybe cut a 2-inch layer, and then I'll back up and take another 2-inch layer. I kind of test the stump right away to see how hard it's hitting. If I'm not seeing chunks fly off, I usually will back away and just leave the stump. I'm not going to waste my time or the lifespan of the brush cutter hammering away on really hard, large stumps. The carbides mounted on the bottom of the blade carrier can also be used for grinding stumps. Obviously the carbide is harder than the steel blades, so it's going to stand up better to some of the dirt and rocks that you're prone to hitting when you're grinding on stumps. And so they also work very well for grinding stumps. My key message here is that you should use the right tool for the right job. Even though you can use our brush cutter as a pusher or a stump grinder, if you have large quantities of material to move or stumps to cut, you really should be using the right tool. So whether that's a grapple or a stump bucket or a stump grinder, you want to be able to have that tool and use that tool in the right application.